The more they read, the clearer it became. Carolyn lived her life with two truths locked inside her. The official truth of a wealthy white daughter and the hidden truth of a sister she called maid. Next, they examined the bundle of letters tied with string. One, dated April 1863, was addressed to Caroline's cousin, Anne Middleton. It confirmed everything. Father has confessed that Rachel, the servant girl, is his daughter. I am in despair. I cannot free her. This scandal would destroy us. But how do I command her as before, knowing what I know? She has father's written acknowledgement. I fear what might happen if it were ever discovered. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. The cruelty wasn't loud, it was quiet, polite, socially acceptable. That made it worse that they moved to the plantation Bible next. Births and deaths were meticulously recorded in the elegant, self-important handwriting of white privilege. But at the bottom of the family page, squeezed into a tight margin, written in a different hand, strong but uneven, were the words that made Sarah's breath catch. Rachel, daughter of Robert Ashford and Sarah, born 1847, sister to Carolyn. And beneath it, a final note. This entry was made by me, Rachel Ashford. On December 20th, 1865, before I departed this place forever. One, add my name to this record, because I am family whether acknowledge. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Rachel had carved her truth into the one book the Ashford family would preserve and pass down. She had made herself unforgettable. She wrote herself into the family, James whispered. She claimed her own name. No one could erase her anymore, Sarah said softly. The last document they opened was another diary entry. Dated December 28th, 1865, 3 years after the photograph. Rachel has left us. She walked away 3 days ago and has not returned. I suppose she waited until the war was won, until the Emancipation Amendment was certain. I should be angry, yet I find I am relieved. Her presence reminded me constantly of Father's sin and my own cowardice. Perhaps now I can forget. The words made Sarah's stomach twist. Forgetting was a luxury only the oppressor could claim. She closed the diary slowly. Rachel hadn't been forgotten. She had documented herself. She had carried her father's confession. She had written her name in the family Bible. She had walked away when freedom became law. And she had left the Ashford family with a truth they would spend generations trying to bury. We're not done, Sarah said, emotion tightening her voice. We need to know what happened to her after she left. James nodded. If she lived into Reconstruction, there should be a trail. Freedmen's Bureau records, census entries, marriages. She didn't vanish. Someone like her wouldn't vanish. Sarah looked at the small confession paper again. The handwriting trembled with guilt, the signature shaky. The words damning. God forgive me for the evil I have done. Now, more than a century later, Sarah realized that Rachel had kept that confession because she knew something no one else had believed at the time. One day, the truth would matter. And today was that day. The next phase of Sarah and James's work shifted from uncovering the past hidden in Charleston to tracing the future. Rachel had carved for herself after freedom. The documents in the donor's box had painted a complete picture of Rachel's life until 1865. After she wrote her name in the Ashford family Bible and walked away from the plantation. Her story vanished from the South. Sarah refused to believe that was the end. If she lived until adulthood, Sarah said, scrolling through digitized databases, there has to be a record somewhere. Freed people didn't disappear. They moved, worked, voted, married, built families. And Rachel was literate, James added, pointing to her confident handwriting in the family Bible. That's rare for someone enslaved. It means she likely valued education. People like her often joined black churches, schools, community groups. There should be a trace. For 3 days, the two researchers dug through archives. They searched Freedmen's Bureau labor contracts, post-Civil War school records, black church membership lists, 1870 and 1880 federal census logs, and dozens of city directories. At first, nothing appeared. Rachel had been one of thousands who fled the South after emancipation, many taking new surnames or using first names only. Every dead end tightened the urgency, Sarah felt. We're missing something, she murmured. Something she would carry with her. Something she would never give up. James looked toward the small confession note resting inside its protective sleeve. She kept her father's last name. He said, Ashford. She signed it in the Bible. She claimed it. That means she might have used it later. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard. She searched again, this time filtering for black women named Rachel. Ashford in the northern states, and then there it was, a census record from Philadelphia. 1,870. Name, Rachel Ashford. Age, 23. Race, black. Occupation, seamstress. Literacy, yes. Place of birth, South Carolina. Household, boarding with other freedwomen. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand. She knew instantly it was her. She made it, Sarah whispered. She escaped the estate, crossed states, and started her life as herself. James leaned forward, scanning the document. She kept her father's name. She claimed the identity they denied her. That's powerful. But the census was only the beginning. They followed her forward through time. In the 1872 Philadelphia marriage ledger, they found Rachel Ashford marries Joseph Freeman, a Union Army veteran, and carpenter Dot. Then came their children. Robert Freeman, born 1873, likely named for her father. Sarah Freeman, born 1876, after her mother. Carolyn Freeman, born 1879, after her sister. A gesture that suggested forgiveness or at least acceptance of the complicated bond between them. She named a daughter Carolyn. James said softly, after everything. That tells us something. It tells us Rachel understood the difference between the system and the individuals trapped inside it, Sarah replied. She didn't forget, but she didn't carry bitterness until her last breath either. They found more records, city directories listing her as a seamstress, then later as a teacher in a black community school. Church registries showing her involvement in women's aid circles. Her children's school records. Her husband's obituary. Her own death certificate dated 1912, listing her parents as Robert Ashford and Sarah. She told the truth to the end, Sarah whispered. Even when no one believed her. Even when no one could prove it. And now, James added, we can. The final step was to find her descendants, using genealogy tools and tracing her children. Through the 1900 and 1910 census records, they located 2 living descendants. James Freeman, retired teacher in Baltimore, Dr. Patricia Freeman Johnson. Physician in Atlanta, Sarah drafted 2 careful emails, attaching nothing emotional, only a request to discuss newly uncovered historical materials that might relate to their ancestry. The responses came quickly. Both descendants agreed to meet on video calls. Their reactions were intensely emotional. James Freeman said quietly, my grandmother used to tell us Rachel's story. She said we were descended from a woman enslaved by her own father. We thought it was family folklore. Now I know it was true. Patricia's voice cracked as she said, she fought so hard to write herself into history. And she succeeded, even if it took 150 years for anyone to see it. The next challenge was the Ashford-Petton white descendants. Tracing Caroline's line through marriage and inheritance led to Elizabeth Petton Harrison, attorney in Charleston. Michael Petton, business consultant in Virginia. Elizabeth rejected Sarah's outreach immediately, calling the research slanderous fantasy. She accused Sarah of trying to destroy a respectable Southern legacy. But Michael responded differently. He told Sarah, voice low with discomfort, I always knew something was wrong in our family's history. My grandmother once mentioned a secret my great-great-great-grandmother begged her never to write down. I think this is it, and I'm ready to know the truth. Both families, black and white, agreed to participate in DNA testing. Weeks later, the results came in. Rachel and Carolyn were half-sisters, sharing the same father with 99.9% certainty that it was irrefutable. The bloodline connected them. Science had confirmed what Rachel had held secretly in her hands in 1863. Sarah closed her laptop slowly, overwhelmed. The hidden truth buried behind a falsified portrait. The truth Rachel carried in a folded square of paper had finally come out. She never let them erase her, Sarah murmured. Never. Now the world will know, James replied, and they both understood. A photograph meant to glorify slavery had instead become the definitive evidence of a crime. The Ashford family spent generations hiding. Rachel had turned her silence into testimony. Yet Blackwood had an answer for everything. When questioned, he said he had stayed at the church alone that night, preparing notes for the upcoming revival and praying well into the late hours. There was no one to confirm his alibi, but his reputation as a dignified, devout man made many hesitate to doubt him. Meanwhile, leads surfaced and fell apart with discouraging speed. A traveling salesman seen in town that week was later found miles away with a solid alibi. A rumor of a stranger camping in the woods dissolved when the man turned out to be an elderly local avoiding a family quarrel. A young man rumored to admire Eliza had been playing cards with friends at the time of the crime, one by one. Every hopeful thread unraveled as August gave way to September. Harsh reality settled in. Milfield was facing something it had never encountered in unsolved killing. The town's quiet routine shifted. Doors were locked earlier. Parents walked their daughters to evening gatherings. Conversations lowered to whispers as if speaking too. Loudly might invite danger closer. Harold Mallister rarely left his house now. Friends brought meals he never touched. From his porch, he stared at the street with hollow eyes, waiting for something that would never return. The once orderly home had become a monument to grief. By October, the investigation had all but stalled. The thin case file, glove, soil, notes, fading photographs sat on Sheriff Haynes's desk like an unanswered question. With no new evidence, no clear suspects, and a town desperate to forget its fear. The case began slipping quietly into memory. Milfield tried to move forward. But beneath the rhythm of daily life lingered a truth the town wasn't ready to face. Someone they trusted had taken 2 young women's lives that night. And while the world beyond Milfield continued to change, new laws, new technologies, new opportunities, the shadow of the Mallister sisters would remain. Waiting for the day, someone looked again into the darkness and asked the questions that had been ignored for far too long. By the mid-1940s. Milfield had transformed on the surface electric lines stretched across roads that had once held lanterns. Automobiles idled where horses once stood, and radios crackled in nearly every living room. But beneath these modern comforts, the old wound of 1920 had never fully healed. Each August, the Milfield Gazette printed the same somber remembrance of Eliza and Constance Mallister. Each year, Harold Mallister returned quietly from Burlington to place flowers on his daughter's graves. And each year the thin case file sat untouched in a metal drawer at the sheriff's office, a silent monument to the town's failure. When Sheriff Robert Haynes died in 1945, his son Thomas, now a decorated military police officer returning from World War II, stood beside his father's bed during his final hours. The elder Haynes, weakened by age and regret, took his son's hand and whispered the burden he had carried for 26 years. The Mallister case, he said, had been his greatest failure, the one truth he had never uncovered, the one injustice he had never corrected. In that fading voice was a plea, a confession, and a command all at once. If you ever have a chance, look again, he murmured. Don't let it die with me. Those words anchored themselves deep in Thomas's mind. And when he returned to Milfield and was appointed sheriff the following year, the very first thing he pulled from the filing cabinet was the old Mallister case, its pages yellowed, its photographs blurred, its clues thin as dust. But to Thomas it felt alive, waiting. He approached it not with grief clouding his vision, but with a trained, methodical eye shaped by years in military investigations. He read every interview, examined every misstep, and made notes in the margins. The Bible pages found in the sisters' mouths drew his particular attention. Both passages condemned severe moral wrongdoing. This wasn't a random act of violence, he realized. Whoever committed the crime believed they were delivering judgment. This detail had been dismissed in 1920, overshadowed by grief and reverence for the church. But Thomas saw it differently. Ritualistic choices, deliberate positioning of the bodies, symbolic messages. These were signs of a killer who believed in some twisted form of righteousness. He also noticed something else the original investigation had overlooked: a pattern of unasked questions. Certain people had been shielded by respect. Certain topics had been avoided out of embarrassment or social norms. Entire avenues of inquiry had died before ever being explored. Thomas decided that if he was going to solve a case that had haunted Milfield for a generation, he would need to revisit the past without the blinders that had limited his father. So he set out to speak with anyone still alive who remembered the night of August 14th, 1920. Old witnesses, former church members, elderly neighbors, people who had once been too afraid or too loyal to speak freely. And slowly, quietly, the town that had spent decades burying its fear began to stir again. Memories long suppressed surfaced in fragments. Small details forgotten by most returned with startling clarity. And one aging witness, holding on to a secret she had carried in guilt for years, stepped forward with something that would tear open the case and reveal cracks in the foundation of Milfield's trust. What Thomas found next would not only reawaken the investigation, it would shatter everything the town believed about the night the Mallister sisters died. Sheriff Thomas Haynes began his renewed investigation in early 1926, visiting the elderly residents who still remembered the events of that long ago summer. Many had grown frail with age, but their memories of the Mallister sisters remained sharp, carried like quiet shadows through the decades. Most offered the same recollections that had been recorded in 1920 routine details. Familiar paths, the girls' gentle natures. But one visit proved different. One visit opened a door that had stayed shut for 26 years. Martha Winters, once the church organist, lived alone now in a small house on the edge of Milfield. When she welcomed Sheriff Haynes inside, her hands trembled slightly, as though she had been expecting this moment for years. They sat at her kitchen table, and after a long silence, she spoke in a voice softened by age but weighted with regret. "I've kept something I should have given your father," she admitted, eyes glistening. "I was afraid of what it might mean for the town and for the church." With careful, almost ceremonial motion, she reached beneath her bed and retrieved a small wooden box. Inside lay a folded note, yellowed and delicate with time. Thomas unfolded it slowly, instantly recognizing the handwriting as belonging to Eliza Mallister. The message was brief but unmistakable. It referenced a private meeting after the prayer service and addressed someone named Thomas. Even more unsettling, the note hinted at a secret. Arrangement the sisters feared would cause trouble if discovered, Martha explained she had found. The note tucked inside a hymn book after the service on the night the sisters disappeared. At the time, the town was shaken and the pastor was deeply respected. She feared stirring scandal and convinced herself it was best to stay silent. But she had never stopped thinking about it, not once. In all those years, as Thomas studied the note again, one line stood out: "We pray your wife never learns." Those words did not fit the life story Milfield believed about Reverend Blackwood, the pastor who had led the church since 1917. Everyone in town knew him as a lifelong bachelor, a man who often referred to the church as his only family. But Martha insisted otherwise. Softly, she told the sheriff that when Blackwood arrived in Milfield nearly 30 years earlier, he had been accompanied by a quiet, pale woman introduced as his wife. The woman reportedly fell ill and passed away within a year, though few townspeople had ever met her. The contradiction was too sharp to ignore. Thomas telegraphed officials in the town where Blackwood had previously worked, seeking records of a marriage or a death. Days later, a reply arrived that deepened the mystery. There was no record of the pastor ever being married, not in Vermont. Not in Massachusetts, not anywhere. The sheriff felt the first unmistakable shift in the case. The original investigation had never dared to scrutinize the church closely. Respect for authority had drawn a line no one would cross. But now that barrier cracked. A hidden truth was beginning to surface, one that tied the sisters, the note, and the pastor together in a way no one had imagined in 1920, with motive, deception, and unanswered questions converging at the parsonage. Sheriff Thomas Haynes knew the time had come to search the pastor's home carefully, and with every detail recorded. What he would uncover there would not simply reopen the case. It would reveal a side of Milfield's history the town had never been willing to see. When the warrant was finally approved, Sheriff Thomas Haynes and 2 deputies approached the parsonage on a cold February morning in 1946. Reverend Thomas Blackwood, now 61, but still tall and composed, opened the door with a serene expression, as though he had expected their arrival. "I've nothing to hide, Sheriff," he said quietly, stepping aside to let them in. His calmness only deepened the unease in the room. The parsonage looked exactly as the town imagined, simple, clean, and humble. Shelves of theology books lined the walls. A well-worn Bible rested on a small reading desk, and the furniture appeared modest enough to suggest a life of service. But Thomas Haynes had already learned that appearances in Milfield could be deceiving. The search began routinely, moving from the living room to the kitchen, then to the narrow hallway and bedrooms. Nothing seemed out of place. No hidden documents, no suspicious belongings, no sign that the pastor lived anything other than the life he preached. Haynes's deputies exchanged uncertain glances. Had they misread the note? Misjudged the clues? Was Blackwood merely an unfortunate man caught in the tangle of a decades-old tragedy? But Thomas's instinct told him the truth was here. Buried somewhere the old investigation had never dared to look. It was Deputy Frank Wilson who noticed the small iron ring hanging from the ceiling of Blackwood's bedroom, an inconspicuous attic pulled door, half concealed by a hanging coat. When they climbed up into the dim space above, the air grew thick with dust and the faint smell of old wood. Boxes and trunks filled the space, untouched for years. Among them, a cedar chest sat locked. It took only a letter opener to pry it open. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Young women from different towns. Some appeared innocent, portraits taken in soft light. Others were unsettlingly intimate, clearly captured by someone the women trusted deeply. And among those faces were Eliza and Constance Mallister, their expressions gentle, unaware, vulnerable. "These aren't church portraits," Wilson whispered, his voice tight. These were taken in confidence. As they continued searching, Wilson tapped on the far wall and noticed a hollow echo. A false panel slid aside, revealing a narrow hidden room built with disturbing precision. Inside was a single cot, a writing desk, and walls completely covered with pages torn from Bibles, each one highlighting verses about sin, purity, punishment, and redemption. The effect was suffocating, like stepping into the mind of someone who had rewritten scripture to rationalize a darker truth beneath a loose floorboard. They found the final piece, a leather-bound journal stretching nearly 30 years, written in Blackwood's unmistakable handwriting. The entries described a pattern town after town, congregation after congregation of gaining the trust of young women, isolating them emotionally, and binding them to him through distorted theology he called spiritual marriage. The Mallister sisters appeared repeatedly in those pages. Blackwood had begun guiding them shortly after arriving in Milfield. Bible study sessions had slowly shifted into private lessons, and private lessons into something far more controlling. Then Thomas reached the entry dated August 14th, 1920. The pastor had written of the sisters wanting to expose their secret arrangement to their father. He wrote of fear, anger, and a twisted conviction that the girls must be purified. The final lines were chillingly calm. He described meeting them as arranged, the knife he carried as an instrument of divine judgment, and the careful way he positioned their bodies afterward. He recorded the verses he placed in their mouths, believing they would guide investigators to understand the nature of their transgression. It was not confession, it was justification. When the sheriff returned downstairs, Blackwood was sitting quietly in his chair, hands folded in his lap. He did not look surprised to see the journal in Thomas's hands. His expression held neither fear nor anger, only resignation. "I wondered when you'd find the room," he said softly. "I have lived with God's forgiveness for many years. Now, it seems it is time to face the judgment of men." Sheriff Haynes read him his charges, 2 counts of first-degree murder. As the cuffs closed around his wrists, Blackwood didn't resist. He simply bowed his head as though beginning a prayer. Outside, the cold winter wind swept across Milfield, carrying the news that would soon break the town's faith in everything it once believed. For the first time in 26 years, the truth had come out of the shadows. But the reckoning for Milfield was only beginning. The news of Reverend Blackwood's arrest shook Milfield to its core. A man the town had trusted for nearly 3 decades, a man who had baptized their children, comforted their families, and preached every Sunday, was revealed to be the very person responsible for the tragedy that had haunted them since 1920, as the evidence from the attic became public, the hidden room, the photographs. The journal shock gave way to grief, then anger. For many, it felt as though the ground beneath the town had shifted. Blackwood's trial began on April 15th, 1946, drawing crowds from every corner of Vermont. The prosecution presented the journal, the photographs, the Bible pages, and testimony from women who described years of manipulation disguised as spiritual guidance. But the most heartbreaking moment came when Harold Mallister, now frail and gray, stood before the court. In a trembling voice, he described the pain of losing his daughters and the deeper anguish of realizing the man he had trusted with their faith had betrayed them. His presence in that courtroom silenced even the hardest skeptics, thought the jury needed less than 3 hours to reach a verdict. Reverend Thomas Blackwood was found guilty on both counts of murder. Judge Porter, known for his measured temperament, delivered a harsh sentence death by electric chair, saying that Blackwood had used the cloak of faith to hide a darkness no community should ever endure. Blackwood accepted the verdict without protest. On November 8, 1947, he was executed. Quoting scripture with his final breath in the months that followed, Milfield struggled to rebuild its sense of safety. Attendance at First Milfield Baptist dwindled until the congregation disbanded, and the church was eventually converted into a community center, a symbolic transformation from secrecy to openness. Using the funds collected from the sale of Blackwood's belongings, the town established the Mallister Sisters Scholarship in 1950, awarded each year to young women pursuing education or the arts, honoring the futures Eliza and Constance never had a chance to follow. Sheriff Thomas Haynes, who fulfilled the promise made to his father, became known across New England for the case that brought justice decades after the crime. His persistence modernized forensic procedures across the state, ensuring evidence would never again be left to decay in forgotten drawers. And yet, the deepest healing came slowly. Each year, fresh flowers appeared at the sisters' graves. Families taught their children the story not to frighten them, but to remind them that danger can hide behind trusted faces, and that truth, however delayed, must always be pursued. Milfield eventually returned to its rhythms, quieter and wiser. The tragedy that once cast a long, suffocating shadow became instead a lesson etched into the town's memory. The Mallister sisters, long silenced, were finally given justice. And the case that once seemed destined to fade into history became proof that even when time obscures the path, the truth, with enough persistence, will always find its way to the light.